It's been said that it only takes a spark to get a fire going, and that certainly applies to the power of words, especially in this environment that we find ourselves in at this very moment, when widespread rhetoric is igniting both figurative and literal flames of conflict, whether it be in Jerusalem, Tehran, or Los Angeles. As we know, October the 7th, 2023 was a day that shocked the world with an evil attack against Jews not seen since the Holocaust. But almost nearly as shocking to me personally has been the hostility directed towards Israel and the Jews since that particular day of infamy. I personally did not see it coming here in our own land to this extent. We have all witnessed history in the making as the words of protest evolved into acts of vandalism and then violence, culminating with murders and attempts to murder Jews. And yet the common refrain is that it is okay to protest as long as it just doesn't get violent. As if that has some sort of way of then letting a leader off the hook, because we all know full well how these things progress. And when they do that, they don't confront the hateful words that are expressed in those nonviolent protests, and that propensity that has to spark the violence. Never a mention of the words themselves. This is a foolish approach, especially for leaders of all kinds, and that is what I want to address today. Clearly, the words used in protests against Israel are designed to arouse the enemies of Israel and to arouse the emotions of people who are naive and prone to being influenced by emotional-driven words, while discounting the need to think rationally about the history that is associated with those words, nor the potential for someone else out there, maybe even in the crowd as we're protesting here, that there might be someone in this group that's going to act on those words in a literal fashion. But no, you press forward and chant on together in an emotionally driven environment. And the irony is that many of these advocates of these particular messages are supposedly the brightest people in our nation. College students, faculty, PhDs. Some of those words come across as mere slogans, like "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." It has such a catchy rhythm to it, doesn't it? Can you see how this can influence a crowd? Sounds innocent. It's just advocating for a cause. But those words can only become a reality if the Jewish state of Israel is wiped off the map. That is the only way from the river to the sea that can be manifested. There is no other way. And there is always someone out there that will act in that particular regard, in a literal fashion. Then you've got the simplified version. Has a cadence to it, right? Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Chanted over and over and over again until it becomes like a worm into your brain that you cannot get out of there. It's like a college cheer, as far as I'm concerned, that students would be doing at a football game. And then it enables you to take selfies of yourself And look at what I'm doing here in this cause. Some of those words are more ominous, like globalize the Intifada. Now that one is a call to violence. Do you know that? That is a call to literal violence. Because while some people will say today that the word Intifada just means protest, I will say to you that that word has never, ever been applied in a context that is outside of violence. Not a single time in history. There have been 3 times in history when an Intifada took place. The first took place in Iraq in 1952, which began with protests against the monarchy that turned into riots, violence, and death. The second time was in Israel from 1987 to 1991, one that I witnessed with my own eyes, because I was there during that time, that began with violent Palestinian protests and acts of civil disobedience that turned into riots and ultimately terrorist attacks. The third time that the word Intifada was applied was in 2000 and lasted in 2005, when Palestinians followed the same escalation from protests and riots to stone throwing, gunfights, rocket attacks, and 138 suicide bombings on buses, restaurants, and other public places that killed over 1,000 Israelis. That is what it means to apply the Intifada. So what does it mean to globalize the Intifada? That means to kill Jews all around the world. It has no other meaning than that. So let us not be naive. The call to globalize the Intifada is truly a sign of endorsing this kind of behavior. And it always begins with words, which connects the dots between the people who speak them and the ones who act on them. In a similar fashion, the obsession with the Iranians to obtain nuclear weapons and to build thousands of ballistic missiles is fueled by the rhetoric calling for the destruction of Israel. That particular time of rhetoric, there has always been like a hatred since 1979 from Iran towards Israel, but the real rhetoric began in the year 2005 when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran at that time, called for, quote, the elimination of the Zionist regime and for Israel, quote, to be wiped off the map. Everything that has followed is a direct reflection of the attempt to accomplish that objective in a very literal fashion. Clearly articulated by the incessant chants, death to Israel, and one more, death to America. And I believe that the leaders of our land are finally coming to the realization that we are as at risk as Israel to what we are seeing right now. Because as the ballistic missiles become more and more powerful, they will be able to deliver them right here. And we're not that far away. And we can be certain that without the intervention of the Air Force of Israel, the rhetoric would have literally turned into a fiery explosion of unspeakable intensity. It would have happened. It would have happened. The lesson to be learned from this ongoing saga can be summed up by the words of Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu. While the action was underway, just here a short time ago, I wrote down these words that he said as he spoke out. First he did it in Hebrew, and then he did it in English. He said, "For decades, the tyrants of Tehran have brazenly, openly called for Israel's destruction, and when enemies vow to destroy you, believe them. So when we think about this present-day conflict, let us consider it in light of what transpired in the days leading up to the Holocaust, which has a very similar kind of pattern. 1 month from now, in July, will mark the 100th anniversary of the publication of Adolf Hitler's book, Mein Kampf. Means my struggle in German. It's the book that Hitler used to reveal his desire to eliminate what he perceived to be, quote, the Jewish threat to Germany. He laid it out in that book, everything that he would do, although not going into the detail of how, but the ultimate intention to eliminate the presence of the Jews in Germany. That was 8 years before he rose to power in Germany. And when he wrote those words, the world did not believe that he would act on it. And that proved to be unwise. And that is why I am convinced that Netanyahu had it right when he said to believe the words of your enemies and then to have the courage to act upon that with wisdom. Now, when we think of the current upheaval that is spreading across our own nation, it is no surprise to me that the protests have turned violent. But it is crucial to notice that the words that are being shouted during the riots and spray painted on walls and on cars before you burn them, words that I will not show you today with a picture because of the profanity, are the very same profane words that were used by politicians here not too long ago in front of crowds in the previous months, weeks and months. The very same profane words. Only a fool could say that they're not connected. A second commonality in all these incidents is that the ones acting on the words tend to take things further than the intent of the original speaker, which is another matter of ignorance and foolishness that leaves no one innocent. I am convinced that the most notorious manifestation along those lines in history involves the pillar of Christianity, Martin Luther, who was largely responsible for the Reformation in the 1500s. But how many people know that Luther was the theological champion of the Nazis because of his hostile rhetoric towards the Jews, which they then used as justification for the Holocaust? Now, many of you are already aware about this because I speak about it now and then. But since the great majority of Christians are unaware, it is a historical fact that bears repeating. This is a copy of the last book that Martin Luther ever wrote. He wrote it in 1543. It's entitled On the Jews and Their Lies. And it's really a shameful polemic. Luther called the Jews to be deprived of all of their social and religious rights in this particular book. I was talking to someone not too long ago who happened to be a Lutheran. I said, "Do you know about this book?" And he said, "Yeah." "Can we talk about it?" And he said, "No." We need to know these words. These are then some excerpts from On the Jews and Their Lies by Martin Luther. He said, "Let the government deal with them in this respect as I have suggested." So you see he's turning it over to the other authorities besides doing things in a biblical fashion. He says first, he's articulating his list of things that he calls for this government to do. First, to set fire to their synagogues or schools, and to bury and cover with dirt whatever will not burn, so that no man will ever see a stone or cinder of them. This is what is to be done in honor of our Lord and of Christendom, so that God might see that we are Christians. Second, I advise that their houses be razed and destroyed. Third, I advise that all their prayer books and Talmudic writings in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught to be taken from them. Fourth, I advise that the rabbis be forbidden to teach henceforth on pain of loss of life and limb. Fifth, I advise that safe conduct on the highways be abolished completely for the Jews. For they have no business in the countryside, since they are not lords, officials, tradesmen, or the like. Let them stay at home. Sixth, I advise that usury should be prohibited to them, and that all cash and treasure of silver and gold be taken from them and put aside for safekeeping. Seventh, I commend putting a flail, an axe, a hoe, a spade, a distaff, or a spindle into the hands of young, strong Jews and Jewesses, and letting them earn their bread in the sweat of their brow, as was imposed on the children of Adam, for it is not fitting that they should let us, accursed goyim, toil in the sweat of our faces, while they, the holy people, idle away their time. No one should toss out these lazy rogues by the seat of their pants. But what will happen even if we do burn down the Jews' synagogues and forbid them publicly to praise God, to pray, to teach, to utter God's name? Accordingly, it must and dare not be considered a trifling matter, but a most serious one, to seek counsel against this and to save our souls from the Jews. That is, from the devil and from eternal death. My advice, as I said earlier, is I wish and I ask that our rulers who have Jewish subjects exercise a sharp mercy towards these wretched people. They must act like a good physician who, when gangrene has set in, proceeds without mercy to cut, saw, and burn flesh, veins, bone, and marrow. Such a procedure must also be followed in this instance. Burn down their synagogues. Forbid all that I enumerated earlier. Force them to work and deal harshly with them. If this does not help, we must drive them out like mad dogs. I have done my duty. Now let everyone see to his. If we wish to wash our hands of the Jews' blasphemy and not share in their guilt, we have to part company with them. They must be driven from our country. And one more. The Jews should be treated as serfs, and they should be tricked into lying so that you would have an excuse to rip their tongues out through the back of their necks. These words are really hard to hear. I don't even want them on my screen. But you see, we need to know that these words are real, they exist, and they have had a profound impact on the world around us, even to this very day. 400 years after those words were written, the Nazis came along and they used this particular book and these things that I've just shown here, articulated in a point-by-point fashion, as the template for the Nuremberg laws in 1935 that deprived Jews of those very civil rights. So that if you put Luther's words in one column and you put the Nuremberg laws in another one, they just line up. So the writings of Luther became a major justification for the Jewish persecution, eventually to the point of genocide. Thus, it is the words of an esteemed figure in Christianity, in Christian history, that other people then have magnified and put in effect in very real ways that I personally have doubts that Luther actually was advocating for. I think he was just speaking in a polemic fashion. But others took it literally. So to put it another way, his words were like a spark that others inflamed, caused to spread, and then stoked themselves by adding more fuel to the fire until it raged, bringing ashes and destruction. Quite literally. That illustrates more than anything that I've ever seen the dangerous power of the tongue. And it doesn't matter what context in which it was exercised. We've seen it over and over again, and it continues on into our present day. Well, it's no different really in the Bible. The Bible talks about these very kinds of things. For it describes narratives with harmful incidents that were ignited by the tongues of people who had a particular agenda. We see that, for example, in the Torah in Numbers chapter 12, where the authority of Moses was challenged by his own sister Miriam and his brother Aaron. We're told in verse 2, and they said, and by the way, if you look at verse 1, it lists Miriam first, so that is typically the manner in which you have the actual person who's speaking the words, but Aaron is coming alongside her. So when it says, and they said, it was literally Miriam who was doing the speaking, and you see that by the results as well. Has Adonai indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well? You catch this? They're talking to Moses, but Adonai heard it. In a way, they were correct, for there were a few times that were recorded in the Scripture that God had indeed spoken through both Miriam and Aaron. But that's not what this is really about here. This is more about a challenge to the authority of Moses to elevate themselves into a position of authority on par with him. Well, God had never established that, so his response was swift. He says, with him, speaking of Moses, I speak mouth to mouth, even openly, and not in dark sayings. And he beholds the form of the Lord, or the shadow of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moses? Why do you have that boldness, I guess, or foolishness? Well, right after this affirmation, Miriam became afflicted with za'arat, which is the Hebrew word for leprosy. Now, this story does have a positive outcome. Why? Because Moses, the one who is being spoken against, actually intercedes on behalf of his sister, the one making the accusation. Did you catch that? He doesn't say, you hear that, Lord? Deal with her. What does he say? Heal her, I pray. This is such a profound example of intercession and dealing with words that are given with a improper intent, and rather inflaming the situation, he diffused it. It's a great example to all of us. Well, this resulted in Miriam's infection going away, and that then enabled the nation to continue on its journey. Well, unfortunately, this was not the last rebellion against the authority established by Adonai, because even a short time later, in Numbers chapter 16, it describes how another group of Israelites, led by someone named Korah, challenged the way that the priesthood was established, very similar kind of a charge, and they claimed that all of the people of the nation were holy. So they're just taking it up a notch. And were thus should be considered as individuals who all should have the privileges of the Kohanim, of the priests, even though God had limited it just to those particular people. Well, this particular incident ended up with a very tragic outcome in the fiery death of the 250 rebels. But when I read that particular story, it makes me wonder if their willingness to act in this rebellious way was sparked and emboldened by the earlier words of Miriam, who received only slight consequences for her actions. It just makes you wonder. Other biblical stories follow similar patterns. In the book of Esther, the profoundly anti-Semitic Haman sparked the attempted destruction of the Jewish people of Persia with his words by saying to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of all other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them." Of course, he throws in a little bribe there too, which, is influential. But we do know that the king acted on those words by using an edict, by establishing an edict that called for the destruction of the Jews. And that would indeed have taken place if it were not for what? The intercession of Esther and Mordecai and the grace of God that enabled them to defend themselves. So the lesson for all of these episodes, the thing that we need to learn is that our words truly have the potential for causing harm. But a key for preventing that harm, of letting it become inflamed and go beyond the initial words, is by the intercession of people that diffuse the hostility, find practical solutions, and restore peace. That is why we need to raise up and vote for leaders who are committed to intercession and mediation instead of mere condemnation and hollow rhetoric that just inflames the circumstances. We need to be raising up leaders who are dedicated to genuine peace instead of promoting a particular political or ideological agenda. Moreover, no matter what the circumstances may be, from international relations to our personal lives, we ourselves must be wise about our own words and deeds. And that is what I want to address in the remaining time today. What does this now mean for me, myself, my relationships? Sometimes we can be careless with the words that we use. And even though we may not intend to offend, characterized by the phrase that we've all used, "Oh, I didn't mean to do that." But the fact of the matter is, they are done carelessly. And there still is a responsibility that we need to recognize here. Because, see, it doesn't matter from the other person's perspective. They really don't care whether you meant it or not. You said it. Sometimes we act without the excuse of ignorance, because in actuality we tend to attack someone by saying something that will provoke a strong reaction with them so that now you can address the reaction. And in so doing, you take the focus off of yourself and your own anger. These are all games that we play by using words in a way that produces harm instead of healing. And it only takes a spark. Certainly, every alcoholic or addict began with one drink or one dose. Likewise, heading down an endless path of hostile speech, where like you're addicted to this manner of speaking, begins with a single moment of lashing out or speaking with hostility. When children hear their parents speak, they tend to be shaped into speaking in the exact same way. The same is true when it comes to the influence of peer groups. That is especially true in regard to profanity. where a person can be perceived to be cool by virtue of the words that you use. Look at him. Listen to her. She's just sticking it to them. How cool that is, to be vulgar. That is why I am convinced that we are seeing so much profanity being spray painted on these vehicles, for example, on the protests and the riots, because some politicians modeled it first for them. And this is a lesson that we all need to learn with the power of our tongue in our families and our other relationships. What about when you hear a word of gossip? How often do we feel free now to pass that on to someone else? We have to verbalize it. Or maybe we use our thumbs to do so, which is basically the same thing. When a word of criticism is directed towards ourselves, how often do we actually listen before we fire back that response? One of the things that I like to do is I like to watch debates going on. Okay, you'll see them on TV all the time. They don't call them debates, but they put people up on, in front of the camera. They got different perspectives. And one person is, speaking, and I like to look at the other person when that's happening, because then they start doing this. They take their mouth like a gun and they cock it, ready to speak at the very moment that the person gives them that tiny little break in the conversation. See, that's not listening. Think about that next time you're in an argument. Most destructive is the case when we are perceived to be hypocrites, when our words and our actions don't match, or when we speak in love in one moment and in condemnation the next. That was the warning of James. Hebrew name was Yaakov. In his 3rd chapter, beginning in verse 8, hear again these words. No one can tame the tongue. It is a restless, evil, and full of deadly poison. Yikes. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come both blessing and cursing. My brethren, all of us here, these things ought not to be this way. See, very clearly, we as human beings have got a real problem with our tongue. All of us. For that reason, this issue has long been a concern within the Jewish culture. In fact, on Yom Kippur, when the formal confession called Al-Chet is recited, nearly 1/4 of all of the confessions are for sins of speech. There's a deeper problem than what we say, however, and that is our hearts, symbolic of our inner selves, our way of thinking. Yeshua very clearly addressed this issue when he said in Matthew 15:18, the things that proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and those defile the man, the entire person. You see, Yeshua is affirming the way that outcomes in our lives are progressive in nature. It starts with our inner thoughts that then become expressed in words and then result in actions that defile us, which has the sense of a life that is profane or unacceptable to God. I have to thank Christina for turning me on to this particular quotation here earlier this week. And it was made by Margaret Thatcher, who was the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who once said, watch your thoughts, for they become words. Watch your words, because they become actions. Watch your actions, for they become habits. Watch your habits, for they become your character. And watch your character, for it becomes your destiny, or the ultimate outcome in your life. Can you see that progression in our lives here? How true it is that when we speak, that the way in which we speak is an indication of who we are. For if we gossip, our self-control comes into question. If we lie, It is because we feel guilty about our behavior and we try to cover it up. If we curse others, it is probably because we have lost compassion for other people, including those who might be considered to be our enemies. And yet, we're created in the image and likeness of God. The message of James that I read earlier is very clear. These things ought not to be this way. And we all need this kind of a reminder now and then, challenging us to gain control of the way that we speak. An important way for us to gain control of our speech is to make a conscious effort to build other people up rather than tearing them down. In biblical terminology, it's called edification. Okay, what is an edifice, right? It's a building. So the word picture here is of a person building a house. But instead of using a hammer and nails, it is about using our thoughts and our words to create a place where people can dwell relationally in peace and safety. Isn't it good when someone has a word of encouragement to you? I know I appreciate that. See, God wants us to be a blessing to other people. Well, what does that mean? How then do we bless other people with our words? Well, see, James goes on to describe that kind of person this way in verse 13. He says, "Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show his good behavior by his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom." Okay, so now when you're getting into wisdom, now we're getting into our thoughts that then are produced in our words and ultimately manifested in our deeds here. Going down to verse 17. But the wisdom from above is first, here we go, pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. All right? So just think about, especially verse 17 here, about how that relates to the words that you use in your conversations. Does that describe you? So here's a simple test in that regard. Is your speech pure, or does it become tainted in a number of ways? Do you actively promote peace, or do you provoke conflict? Do you speak gently, or are you known for being harsh in criticism? Are you reasonable in your expectations, or do you blast others for every single mistake that they make? Are you full of mercy continually in your life, or continually condemning other people's behavior? Do you actually speak in such a way that the good fruits in your life are manifested? Or do you spend most of your time talking about the horrible things that are going on in your life and in the world around you? Are you unwavering in your words, consistent from one moment to the next? Or are you the kind of person that varies his or her manner in such a way that the way that you speak depends on the setting in which you find yourself? Lastly, do the words that you speak truly reflect your inner character, or do you say one thing and then do another? See, this is a challenge that we all face. But it is an important thing to realize that God is calling us to control our language, to control our tongue. And that means, first of all, submitting our thoughts to God's wisdom and standards of righteousness. Can you imagine what this world would be like if the leaders of our world, if the other nations of our world, if the leaders of our own nation, if the people out on the streets and the people everywhere you turn were to speak in this manner that I'm describing here today? I believe that one of the reasons why they speak out so harshly is they believe that this is where their true power is found. fight back with power. But let us recognize that there is another kind of power in the words that we use. Today we've focused primarily on the destructive and dangerous forms of the power of our words. But you see, the opposite is also true. Think about the power that comes from these words. I love you. I am sorry. I was wrong. I forgive you. There's power in those words. Real power. And the most life-changing words of all with power are, Yeshua, I believe in you. Forgive me of my sins. Come into my life as my Messiah and my Master. Oh man, that's power over your own sinful nature, your own past, everything about you. There's power in those words because God will transform you into the kind of person that He can use in even more powerful ways. Let us all weigh with great importance what we say and do. Our families deserve that. Our friends and our neighbors need that too. And the world around us is watching us closely, sometimes at least. Our testimony is constantly active. We need to recognize this. You are always testifying, whether you realize it or not, and whether it is pleasing to God or not. It only takes a spark. But will it be a spark that leads to destruction in our relationships? Or the kind of spark that is warmly received by others and enables us to have the great privilege of being the voice of God to the world around us? And that this world that desperately needs to know the truth about the living Word, and that is our Messiah, Yeshua.